Dear all, I would like to welcome you to our 19th lecture by now in the series of Rosfeed lectures. We are organizing these lectures to hopefully inspire, to inform, to also create a discussion among our audience about open issues, about possibilities for Ukraine and what we think is necessary to talk about. Sometimes there are more discussions. Tonight we really have a lecture, but always hopefully ends up in a discussion with you, the audience. Thanks again for being here. We are pretty excited tonight to have a discussion about data. But first of all, a very practical thing, we are being simultaneously translated for everything we say by Olena Nevjadova, who you see here on the screen. To enable that, you have to choose your language, and you can see that underneath in your screen you have a button which says interpretation, and then you can choose a channel, either the Ukrainian channel or the English channel, to choose what you want to hear and how you want to communicate in. So all choose your channel and hear tonight in the language of your choice. You can also react, and please do so by using the Q&A for that. You can write your questions in Ukrainian, or you can write your questions in English, whatever language you choose, and we will cater to that as well. Tonight I will keep it very short because I really want to give the floor to our speakers. It is, as I said, about data, and we invited our two speakers for basically two reasons. One, because the use of data in urban planning and urban design becomes more and more relevant and more used in several aspects, you could say, of urban planning. But then it's important on how do you retrieve those data and how to use them, and what are the benefits of it and the use possibilities of it, but at the same time also what are the possible challenges, or let's call them dangers. These two aspects are more complicated in a war situation than in other circumstances, and that has to do with the possibility of retrieving the data, which is much more difficult. But also the use of the data, you have to be careful, even more careful than in other cities. So we like to address the both aspects, how to retrieve them and how to use them, and we do that with two special guests that will be introduced by the Ukrainian moderator of tonight, which is Yevgen Gabasin. So I'll give the floor to you, Yevgen, please.
Доброго дня, мене звати Євген, я архітектор.
Welcome everyone. My name is Yevgen Kabasin. I'm an architect and I am an organizer of architectural conferences, and I am a participant of Rosfeed Urban Coalition for Ukraine. Today I am your Ukrainian moderator. I'm happy to introduce to you our two today's speakers, Ed Parham, architect and director in innovation and design in Space Syntax. His role is to design instruments to analyze cities and apply them to real projects. He headed multidisciplinary teams of designers to create master plans of capital cities in order to create living environment that would function efficiently. Today he is talking about using data for short-term interventions for long-term effects. Our next lecturer is Adam Kňaze. He's a senior consultant for AI and a head of Geoanalytics for PricewaterhouseCoopers in Slovakia. He started as a specialist in computer vision and distance zone probing, and he designs instruments using AI. Some of his projects involve detection of objects using satellite imaging. And today he will tell us about using satellite data in urban design. Mr. Parham, you have the floor.
I believe it's actually me who has the floor, because I am starting the presentation today. We will get to Ed very shortly, though. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Thank you for the interaction again. Thank you very much. Hopefully right now you should be able to see my screen, my presentation. So let's get into it. My background, as Yevgen said, my background is technological. I'm software engineer by background, and we focus on AI data analytics, and even more focus on Earth observation data and computer vision. So what that means, basically, we are using computer vision to analyze satellite images, aerial images, drone images, all kinds of images, and not necessarily only images, and extracting some insights from that. A lot of my projects are related to cities, because these kinds of insights that we can gather are super important for urbanism, for urban planning, urban design. So naturally, that's where the projects are. All right, without any further ado, let's get into the topic at hand. So the sort of main, I would say, message here is that in urbanism, accurate information about the current state of the environment is key. I mean, this is kind of obvious, right? Because if you want to do the cities right, you have to understand the people who are living there. You need to understand all the actors within the cities, how they interact, how everything works together, in order to basically tailor the city, to customize the environment to their needs. And this goes into two, let's say, directions. So one of them is urban design. So how we design the cities, how we design the living environment so that they work for the people, not against them, basically. If you don't do that right, you end up with a situation like this, right? So on the left side, you can see that the planners, the designers had some idea about what the people need, what the people want, and the people had other ideas. So then, of course, we all have to go and fix that, right? Good fixed. On the right side, that's another situation. So the demand basically doesn't exist, and the offer is a 20-lane highway. I mean, generally speaking, 20-lane highway is never going to be a right answer for any kind of question. But again, we can see this kind of a mismatch between what the people need and what we have. So again, we will have to fix that. Again, much easier to do in Photoshop, as I'm doing right now, than in reality. Okay, so that's urban design. And the other sort of side of the coin is urban management. So that's the day-to-day operations. Basically, when you are running the city, the services, again, you need to know what's happening in that city, and sort of naturally, cities are sort of large beasts and they are complicated. There's lots of things going on. So you need a way to be able to understand, to monitor, to know what's happening in these cities, ideally remotely. And this is sort of a problem that we as humans had and we're sort of trying to solve for a long time. Basically trying to answer if we can know what's happening in the world without leaving our desk. For the long time, the answer was no. Somebody would have to go there to know what's happening. Then we made some progress. This was one of the early attempts. It doesn't look like much, but this is actually a first picture of Earth taken from satellite. It was sometime during the 60s, I think. Not very good, but we improved quite quickly over time. This is a picture taken from a crew from one of the Apollo missions when they were flying towards the moon. And fast forward to today, basically, today, if you want to know what's happening in some remote part of the world, basically without leaving your desk, you just, I don't know, open Google Earth or something and type up the name, and there you go. For example, here I wanted to know what some remote part of Kyrgyzstan, some dam, what's going on there. Well, I just go and Google that. This is obviously nothing new for you. What you might not have been sort of aware of is just how available and accessible the data is. There are multiple constellations of satellites, both private and public, that are constantly orbiting Earth. There are constellations with hundreds of satellites, literally hundreds of satellites constantly orbiting Earth and taking pictures, and these pictures are available to you. So, for example, here, this is a portal where you can access imagery from European Space Agency available for free. So here I'm looking at the same dam I had in the Google Earth, but let's say I want to see how it looked like, I don't know, in October 2022. There you go, you have the picture, you have the full archive, and you can observe the changes throughout the time. So this is the same dam, let's say in October, then I can switch to, I don't know, somewhere during summer, let's say June, and it already tells me some sort of information, right? I can see, for example, based on the width of those lines along the coastline, what's the level of water in the reservoir, and then I can go 4 years back, same time of the year, and I can see there's much more water 4 years ago in the reservoir. This is already an information that I can work with, I can do something with. And satellite imagery allows us to get that kind of insights. One last thing I'd like to mention here is that we are not limited to images only. What you're looking here, those are videos taken from satellites. And these are available commercially, so you can just go and pay a satellite operator. They will like literally turn their satellites in orbit, and they will take a video of your location. It's not going to be super cheap, like 1 minute costs around $4,000, but it is doable. Okay, so based on that, we might say that yes, thanks to satellites, we know what is happening in the world without leaving our desk. So let's try putting that into practice right now. Just imagine that you are working for a city, for example, and you are doing some inspections of the property taxes, for example. So there you go, you have your aerial picture in this case, and you are going basically house by house and trying to verify its dimensions, for example, its parameters, comparing it to the tax returns. And what you will see quite soon is that even though you have the data available to you, it's the volume, the sheer volume of data, the size of the cities is so large that if you were to do this manually, you are kind of out of luck. You're not going to be able to do this just manually because there's too much information, too much stuff to look out for. So the answer becomes that although you can look anywhere you want, you can't look everywhere. That's like a huge limitation we have as humans. The nice part is that even though you specifically can't look everywhere, computers can. That's sort of their thing, that they can do things fairly quickly and they could automate stuff for us. It was not so easy for a long time because processing images is a sort of known issue for computers. It's a difficult task for them. But thanks to AI and computer vision, we are able now to solve these kinds of tasks. And we can do tasks such as, for example, object detection. So in this case, I can detect that there is a squirrel in the image. Or I can do image segmentation. So see where exactly the squirrel is, what's the size of the squirrel in this case, for example. And I can also do change detection. So I have a series of images. I look for change and identify what's the meaning behind the change, thanks to AI automatically, and then use that information. And when we combine these two things together, we can now, I would say, solve the age-old problem of can I know what's happening in the world? Yes, I can, because satellite imagery will give me the data and AI will give me the insights from the data. So let's put it into practice. I will show one project that we did. This one is, I would say, more relevant in the peacetime. We will get to some applications related to reconstruction a bit later. But basically here, the idea is that we are using satellite images and other geospatial data to verify, in this case, property tax declarations. So we start with a layer of a land registry, for example. We combine it with the property tax returns, and we get a version that's a sort of geospatial version that tells us what was reported. Then we take the aerial data. This is high resolution data, where we can see all the houses quite clearly, we can analyze them. But it's, as I said, there's too many of those. So we will use AI to identify them. Sorry for the lagging. Like there are actual aerial images in here. PowerPoint is not built for that kind of thing. As you can see, the AI identified all the buildings. And in this case, I will take into account mainly the dimensions. And I can compare those with the stuff that was reported. And I will get a list of discrepancies. Very quickly, very easily. And this is something that I can then act upon, again, in an automated fashion. I can verify if that's correct or not. We applied it to similar case where we focus on the surfaces. So this was related to rainwater management. The goal was to map what is the amount of impervious surfaces in an area. So here you can see highlighted in purple, those are impervious surfaces like asphalt, concrete, stuff like that. And in green, you will have some vegetation, bare soil, and similar. Again, we can cross-check and compare it with other records and get a list of discrepancies very quickly. One thing that I would like to highlight here is that we can use the same sort of approach, same pipeline for two different tasks, just retrain the model for two things. So here it is identifying the type of surface. Here it is identifying just the buildings. Everything else stays the same. And I can train it to identify other things, identify pools, identify solar panels, or identify buildings that are under construction or buildings that are damaged. Those are all things that we can just retrain and then use, automate the whole process, get the insights, and do something with those. This is useful from the standpoint of the management. One more thing I'd like to mention here is that a nice advantage of satellites is this, as I said, they're constantly orbiting Earth. So we get new pictures with some frequency so that we can observe the change, right? So here, for example, this is a data from satellite constellation that has a daily frequency. So one picture, new picture every day with 3 meter spatial resolution. So it is not, let's say, sharp enough for some use cases, but for other use cases, you can very clearly identify change and do something about it, basically almost in real time. Okay, now I will jump into the urban design side of things. So here, the name of the game basically is combining as many layers, as many sources of information as we can. So the reason for that is any kind of change, any kind of intervention that you do in the city will impact many different aspects of how the city works. And all those different aspects are going to impact your change back. So you have many things playing together that you need to keep in mind. And the sort of advantage of Earth observation data, these kinds of sources, is that you can collect many of these aspects or map many of these aspects remotely, automatically, and then work with those. So here, for example, I have a scan of a piece of city. I can use that to identify the land use. I can use that to identify all the buildings, their shapes and stuff like that, their type, their use. I can, with a satellite image, I can monitor the temperature, basically heat within that area. That's going to be relevant later. I will get to that immediately. Also, we can collect, for example, pollution information. So yeah, I'm talking about air pollution here. Lastly, for example, I can monitor all the vegetation. There are many more layers that I can get, but basically the idea here is that I can gather as many layers as I can, and then I use this information to plan my, let's say, interventions. So, for example, in one of the layers, I noticed there's a lot of air pollution along that long road. That's probably because of the traffic. Maybe planting some vegetation there would be helpful. Now, to just be clear here, I'm not an urban planner. I have no clue what intervention makes sense and what doesn't. Ed is the person who's actually going to be able to tell what makes sense in this case. But my goal here is to give him as much data as possible so that he can make the best decision possible, right? So here, for example, another intervention would be that there was maybe some noise pollution from some area or air pollution from some area, that there's maybe some construction going on, or industrial area. there I can also identify suitable locations for solar, for example, this way automatically. So when I have these kinds of interventions, I can basically measure and simulate their impact on other aspects. And speaking about the simulation even more specifically, when I do this enough times, when I get enough data, I can then train the model, train AI to predict what's going to be the effect of my interventions. So it's not just me theoretically thinking, oh, if I plant some trees here, it's going to lower the heat, for example. It's going to be, if basically if I show enough examples to the AI of this is what was the situation before, this is how all these different aspects look like, this is what it looked after the intervention, and this is how it changed. The model is then able to train and to identify and basically predict what is going to be the effect of this different intervention. And then, of course, it's going to be able to suggest some of these, basically help me even more and even better identify what should be done to improve the city there. So I will get to a project again here real quick. This is a urban heat report. I will switch over to a demo I have here. So this is a urban heat report. This is a project where we are using temperature information. We are basically one of the satellite types that are available is specifically modified so that it can collect temperature data. So, I mean, it's pretty much similar to if you've seen in those action movies when they have, you know, heat signature glasses and they can see heat. This is sort of similar thing, but on a satellite. And that's super useful because it helps us track basically thermal behavior of a city. This is a super important aspect here because thermal comfort is key in many aspects for how the city is livable. How well does it work for the people that living there? Also, given the current climate change and all of that, this is becoming more and more important even in these sort of parts of the world. And so here what we created is a page that partly gives you the insights, but also tries to make the topic, the concept of urban heat islands more understandable to lay audience, let's say. So here, for example, all these colors in the background, those are actually colors from satellite images. If we just take the satellite images, you can see that they are, well, it won't tell me much, but if I switch it to a version that's basically normalized to show the difference, I can already see that some areas are getting more hot, more warm than others in the city. There are different types of satellites. So some of those I get, like in this case, I get many pictures very often, but they have low resolution. I can't really see here in this picture what is the specific area that's getting hot. Whereas here I have the type of picture that I don't get that often. It takes longer time for the satellite to get back and take another picture, but it is a higher resolution. Here you can see with the zoom basically magnifying glass, I am showing you the other picture of the same location. I can see, for example, the river over here. I can basically go to the area, to the sort of level of individual streets, sometimes even individual buildings, instead of the level of whole districts. And so I can see the data. I can basically try to understand it, try to analyze it. Here is a good visualization that sort of drives the point home, which allows you to filter out the temperature. So here is the temperature map, and I can move down here a filter and remove all the areas that are cold. And basically, it's sort of similar to just raising a sea level, and all the areas that are low are sort of swallowed, and only the high ground remains. In this case, the high ground is the hottest area, and that is the heat island. That's why the name. And I can go in and see what is the source of the hottest heat island. This specifically is in Bratislava, where I am based. And this is one of these large shopping malls with massive parking all around. It's just doing something very, very wrong. and the area is getting more warm than the surrounding areas, even if it doesn't really need to. All right, I'm gonna move on real quick just to mention here why is something like this important. Basically, this chart kind of highlights it for me. The data is super important. We as a people can understand data in various forms, but there is a huge difference when we are working with data in form of a Excel sheet, for example, just a bunch of numbers in some rows. And when we see it visualized like this, in a map, basically in a picture, so the whole problem becomes much more understandable and much more approachable to us, right? So if I just saw some numbers telling me that this area is getting more hot than the surrounding area over here, I can try to get some insight from that. But when I see it, I can already tell, okay, there's a huge building here with no shade around there, and this is getting colder because there's a larger, let's say, group of trees, almost a forest there, and I can see how does it play out in the open, basically, what effect do all these different kinds of environments have when it comes to the temperature. We looked at the different, let's say, land uses, types of land use, and what their effect is. All of this automatically from public data. I'm not going to go into much detail here, but basically the goal is to spell out what are the effects and then what you should do to improve the areas. Regarding the making this approachable to the public, I would just like to mention here that we have a small quiz where you have some location on Earth, and you have just the temperature picture, and you are supposed to find famous locations. So here, for example, is Central Park. If you know where Manhattan is, it's going to be much easier for you. But you can also guess that the Central Park should be colder than surrounding area because it's a lot of vegetation there. And so I can go in and see there's this patch of land. Let's give it a try. Oh, I can't find the, let's see. Oh, it's great. Finally made it. All right, we have a couple more of those, but I'm not going to spoil the fun here. All right, let me get back to the presentation and get finally to the topic that we have here. Let's see. All right, good. So finally, all of these things, they are super valuable, important in, let's say, during peacetime, but these things become even more important, or they have a different kind of value during wartime, during what is happening in Ukraine right now. And one story to illustrate it is this one. Basically, I found it in Guardian. It was about United Nations using satellite images to track destruction of basically cultural heritage in Ukraine. And it makes a lot of sense to use satellite images for this. There are, let's say, multiple advantages. So first of all, it's remotely collected. And in the case of a war zone, as is the case right now, you can collect those images basically from the safety of your living room, honestly, because those satellites are constantly orbiting around, and you can get the information without exposing yourself to the danger, which is like super important, right? This is one of the issues with these kinds of situations, these kinds of conflicts, that you cannot get accurate information in time because you cannot access it physically because it's too dangerous. In this case, when we are talking about satellite imagery, Earth observation data, we just have the information right there. Also, it is authoritative. Basically, what that means is you can't really fake it, right? The satellite, you can't fool the satellite, plus there's multiple constellations. So even if you manage to fake one satellite picture, all the others are going to capture the truth. So that's super useful. And finally, you have full coverage there. So they're going to be able to capture everything. I see that I'm running out of time, so I will speed it up. The example that I've shown with United Nations is nice, but the issue is you can use that if you're doing it manually as they were. You can use that only for let's say a couple of use cases. Basically, if you wanted to apply the same approach to, let's say, households, again, you will run out of time very quickly if you're doing it manually. So that's where AI comes again into play. With AI, we are able to automatically identify these cases, to verify these cases. And this is super useful in terms of, for example, mapping the damage so that we know what is the extent damage, where it happens. We can use that to coordinate international aid, for example. It can be used if there is some sort of insurance case or something, right? So you are able to prove that this happened without visiting the place physically. That's something that can speed up the aid efforts considerably, because you have this kind of clarity. It can also help you to communicate the extent of the damage that's happening. Again, super important thing. And when we are talking about planning, as we will get to that later, I think Ed will, it also helps us to know what is the scale of destruction, what areas are affected, to what degree, and we can do that again automatically. This is a city of Bakhmut, we just, basically razed to the ground, but in other cases, we can identify which areas are affected in which way, which can be used then in the future urban planning. Single last point I would like to mention, we can use these kinds of information, these images, to track vegetation as well, which will tell us a lot about the long-lasting effects of this war, also in the countryside. I know it's slightly outside of the urban topic here, but basically we can track vegetation, we can track farming activities, we can get the sort of series of data and identify farming operations, and then we can identify absence of those operations. This map, for example, shows you all the fields in Ukraine that were not planted because of the effects of war, because there is, for example, here a front line coming right through. Lastly, these scars are typically quite lasting. So here is an image from the north of France, where you have some areas that are still basically inaccessible, like hundreds of years after the First World War, because of the amount of ammunition and the sort of toxicity in the area. So again, satellite images will help you map those areas and plan the response, organize the response in an effective fashion, so that it doesn't end up this way in Ukraine once the war ends. Okay, apologize for running over time, but this is really all from my side. Thank you, and thank you.
Дякуємо вам, Адам,
Thank you very
надзвичайно.
much, Mr. Kňaze. It was really very interesting. And I see that we have quite a lot of questions. And I see that your instruments, which you have presented today, have caused great interest in our audience. But I guess that it is effective to continue with the questions after the second lecture, which will be presented by Ed Parham, who represents these syntax, and he is going to talk about how to use data for long-term effects. Go ahead, please, Mr. Parham, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. It's really an honor to be speaking to everybody. And thanks, Adam. I thought it was really interesting. And there were some really good points, I think, especially this issue about visualizing and spatializing data makes a huge impact in terms of how understandable things are, and just making things visible is really, really important part. I'm going to share my screen. And while I am doing that, hopefully, is that sharing properly? That should be full screen. Yeah, great. What I'm going to talk about is being able to position data. So to be able to start to, first of all, think about what kind of data you have, to be able to put that into a conceptual framework to understand how the data that you've got affects what happens in cities, how that daily activity then goes on to affect long-term impacts and outcomes. Really quick bit of background, I'm an architect. I'm not an expert in post-war reconstruction, but what I'm hopefully going to explain more about is the way that we can use data to understand cities, understand how they work, and how if you're in a situation where you need to repair and improve places, but you have limited resource, you can use that data to make sure that you're improving the bits that everybody will benefit from. Really quick background to Space Syntax. We were a spin-out company from University College London, from the Bartlett, about 35 years ago. Space Syntax, the company, is completely independent from the university, and we work on a whole variety of different projects where sometimes we might be lead designers, sometimes we're supporting other designers, we might be providing digital tools or data sets, carrying out research or doing training. So this is what I'm going to talk about, is first of all, talking about positioning data. And there's this framework, which is a way of kind of simplifying it, which I'll explain more in a minute. But it's this idea of what, where, when, and why. And some of these elements become particularly important if you're a designer and you're trying to change a set of systems or a city. You need to understand why things happen in order to then change what happens itself. So it's really important to be able to position data against this framework. I'm then going to explain a bit more about how we can analyze that data, and that's particularly about Space Syntax. And then I'm going to give a really quick example of a project that was about trying to optimize the impact of limited resource. So what we're really interested in at Space Syntax is, this is a set of stories that you see in the news in the UK, and you see them fairly regularly. This is quite old now. This is about 4 or 5 years old. And it's that people have just bought a new house, but they're really unhappy because they spend the whole time driving everywhere. This particular example, this housing estate, is very close to the center of a small town. It's just the other side of these houses, but you can't actually walk to it because of the way the grid of streets has been designed. You can't directly walk to the center. The public realm isn't very good. You have to cross busy roads. There isn't a pavement. People don't feel safe. So the built environment, the way that that part of town has been designed, affects what people do and how they move around. There's more and more medical research that's emerged in the last 10 to 15 years, and that starts to relate the activities, things like the activities that people take part in on a daily basis, and long-term impacts like health, but it could also be climate change. So this particular paper was a medical paper linking the way that people get to work with the risk of obesity. And what it was finding was that people that took public transport to get to work were at lower risk of obesity. Now, those individual impacts, they have an impact on the individual person, but they have a wider impact on society. And this is some research that was looking across the EU, and it was finding that the cost to society in terms of days lost due to sickness, the health service costs, impacts of climate change, driving costs society a certain amount per kilometre, but cycling and walking actually generate a benefit. So we can see this kind of chain of events. There's the built environment, it affects what people do, that has impacts on the individual and on wider society. And what we're really interested in at Space Syntax is to be able to model and explain the built environment. So to take the systems that you can change as a designer or a planner, the street network, the land use, the density, see how they all fit together and see how that makes things possible or not possible. So just as an example, this is a measure that we have that explains within a city how dependent you are on having a car to get to a range of different uses. So the point of this is, first of all, you can understand what makes somewhere car dependent. Is it the grid of streets? Is it the land use? Is it the density? You can then work out, how do we avoid places becoming car dependent in future? So how can we shortcut this cycle and not put in place the conditions that lead to these sorts of negative outcomes? So that's the kind of conceptual framework. So the built environment is affecting your daily activity, and that has longer term impacts and outcomes. So we can then start to use that to position data. So I've already talked through some of these pieces, but we can think of the built environment, and we would include the street network, the public realm, open space, the buildings, the density, the facades and the interfaces. That physical set of systems makes certain decisions or activities possible or impossible. It can make places really walkable, or it can make them car dependent. So within that physical environment, there are other layers in a city, and we can think about things like public transport. They can mitigate some of the conditions that have been created, but they are restricted by some of the constraints, and they might introduce their own constraints. So you might live in a part of the city that's very car dependent. You might have access to the bus, but the bus might be really expensive, or there might be 2 buses an hour, and it might take a really long time to get where you want to go. That affects people's perceptions, that affects their daily behaviors and their activities. And then we've seen how that affects the impact on the individual and wider society. So we can use this to then start to position data. And one way to do that is to think of this as almost like a really simple science experiment. So in a science experiment, you've got a set of variables that you can change. If you're a designer, those variables are really important to understand how the things that you can design affect what's actually happening on a daily basis. So those variables include the built environment, the transport services, and the way that people then respond to them and think of it. And we can talk about how you mix those variables together. That's almost the experiment, and that experiment creates a result. And we can talk about the behavior and activities and the impacts being the result. And in some ways, that result data is showing you what happens, where it happens, and when it happens. And there's lots of different sources for this kind of data. There's lots of, in the last few years, there's been lots and lots of things like live kind of activity data coming from phones, from devices, from lots of different places. And what we're really doing is positioning that live data as result data. So it's showing you that something is happening, where it happens, and when it happens. The really important thing in this is that if you're designing a city and you want to change the impact and the outcomes that happen, you need to understand why those things are happening. And that's where this system data becomes really important. Now, this data, the data that's affecting the decisions that people make, how far they are, how far they live from their work, that doesn't change very quickly. Once a city's built, those systems change very, very slowly. So what we're starting to do here is to be able to position data so we can have system data explaining why something happens and result data that shows what happens, where and when. So to give you a really quick example of this, this is London Bridge. This is a photo in the rush hour. It's standing on the north side of the bridge, looking south. And what you can see is everybody is on the same side of the pavement. If you look in the background over here, that side of the bridge has almost nobody on it. Now, to understand why that happens, we need to start to look at some of the systems that we can start to understand. So this is where the photo is taken from. It's looking to the south. And what we can see is there's a big station here that has thousands of people coming into it every hour. The other side of the river, there's a huge density of employment. It's probably the most employment in the whole country is concentrated in this square mile. The bridge itself is particularly important, not just because it links the station to the employment, but because it connects into the wider city. And this side of the pavement is important because it connects directly into the station. So that's why everybody's on that side of the pavement. Now, if we go back, I think this photo is from the 60s. And what's really interesting, again, it's a slightly different angle. It's taken from higher up, but it's standing on this side of the river and it's looking south. Again, it's rush hour, and you can see everybody is on the same side of the pavement. Now, in the time since this photo was taken, there's a new station has been built. The station's been redeveloped. There are new buildings in the city. Lots and lots of office buildings have been redeveloped. The public realm of the bridge has changed. It has cycle lanes, fewer lanes of traffic, more pavement, but still everybody is on the same side of the bridge. And what that's really telling us is that the big systems in the city are really, really influential on what happens on a daily basis. And they're really what is affecting these kind of patterns of daily activity. So to feed this back into this kind of framework of why something happens versus what happens where and when, the kind of the live data or the data that might come from devices or IoT things is really explaining where are the people, what's happening, where and when. And you can see that in things like Google. To understand why it happens, then you need to be able to take data on the system and to analyze that system data to understand this is the bridge that we were looking at. This is a connectivity analysis. And what it's telling us is that these red lines are really well connected. And so they're much more likely to be used by people who are moving. So we need this combination of different data sets, first of all, to see what's happening. But secondly, we need to be able to understand why does it happen and how do the systems that we can affect as planners and designers influence these things. So that's this way of positioning data. What I'm going to explain now is how we analyze the built environment and some of those particular systems. So we're going to really focus on the built environment, and space syntax is really interested in the spatial network. It started by looking at essentially how people perceive space and how they move through it. In the last 10 years, more data has become available, technology's improved, more people can code. We can make bigger models and they're more complicated, we can process them quicker, and we can start to link all of these things together. We can link land use and density and public transport and the street network all at the same time. But what I'm going to talk about now is just the spatial network. So just the network of streets and pedestrian routes. And the starting point for this is to understand when somebody is in a space, how do they move through space, and how do they perceive space, and how do they move through it? So what space syntax does is it takes data on the street network, and what it starts to do is analyze it from the perspective of a person on the ground. So these analyses here, what they do is take every single section of a street, and they look at, if you were moving through it, which are the streets which are easiest to move into and easiest to move out of. So we look at the change in angle between different segments. And essentially what we're doing is taking individual streets, analyzing it as a graph, and we're using the angular cost as the way of looking at the relationships between individual segments or nodes, and how easy it is to move across an entire system, or to be able to see which streets are more important than others to move across a system. So what we have is something that can be generated from centerline data. It can be analyzed quite quickly, and we have different ways to measure how that network is performing. So we could look at the streets which are most useful for people to move through on their way from anywhere to anywhere, or the streets which are most useful if people are walking locally. We can look at the streets or the parts of a city which are closer to everybody. And we can, the really interesting thing is you can look at the spatial network as a system on its own, and you can see that it creates hierarchies and structures within it. But the really important question is, how does that relate to actually what's happening in a city? So what we've got here is an extract of a model of London. The red lines are the better connected spaces. The blue ones, the ones which are much less well connected. And what we found through all the work that has happened at UCL, but also through all the work that we've done as a practice, and there's a much bigger academic community globally that have been applying these techniques, is that there are a set of consistent relationships between the spatial network and the structures that it creates, a set of daily activities, and a set of then longer term impacts. And this is really a way of thinking about a city as a complex system, and a complex system that's made of lots of systems. They interact with each other, they create feedback loops, and that affects the way that things happen in cities. So the first consistent finding that we see is that better connected spaces have higher levels of movement on them. So this is a scattergram, a really old scattergram, looking at how well connected somewhere is. And what we've done is collect pedestrian movement across a whole range of different places. And we typically find these relationships. So the better connected spaces have got more people. So the red lines are where there are more people. And people are on those spaces because they're easier to see into, they're easier to walk through, and they're more likely to be used on your way from somewhere to anywhere else. What then becomes really interesting is that this creates a feedback loop to the city. So if you then understand where there are more people, certain things in a city need to be close to people, certain things need to be further away from them. So what we've just put on in the background here is land use. If you take London, if you look at shops, most shops need people walking past, they need customers. And what we find in London is that 80% of the shops are on the top 20% of the best connected lines. So if you're a shop, you really need to be on a red line, because otherwise you won't have enough customers coming past, you'll go out of business and you have to start doing something else. Now, these relationships are fairly consistent in places around the world. We've seen these happening in cities in the Middle East, in places like China and South America, all over the place. We find some things are really consistent across cities. So that's a little bit about how we can understand the way that the spatial network is influencing activity and how that then goes back to affect the city. Now, another part of this is around the kind of practicalities of changing a city. And the street network is really, really difficult to change. This is a map of the City of London, and it's from 1666. So that was the year of the Great Fire. This was the area that was destroyed. And at the time, there was a competition, 6 or 7 architects designed master plans to rebuild the city. It was won by Christopher Wren. This isn't Christopher Wren's proposal, but his one. But what happened was it was too difficult to reallocate the land to change the spatial network. So they couldn't agree on somebody's house had been burnt down. They couldn't agree on how that parcel of land should be bought or paid for, transferred to somebody else. And what happened was that the exact same layout of streets was built back as was there before. So once the spatial network is there, even when it is almost completely missing, it's really difficult to change it. Now, what we can do, and there's maybe some bits we could come back to on here later on. There are some really interesting comparisons to if you look at what happened to London during the Second World War, when there was a lot of damage, then really interestingly, a lot of what was there before was built back. There are places where things changed quite dramatically, and old terrace streets turned into larger kind of modernist housing estates. But there are also places where new buildings were accommodated within the existing public realm, or sorry, within the previous spatial network of the city. And actually, a lot of the damage to cities has been done by the way that highways have been cut through cities, and they've broken these small human scale networks and made it possible to drive across the city really quickly, but they've made it impossible to walk across the city. So what we can do from all of this is we can design places in a different way. And this should hopefully, sorry, it should play. Let's just turn off this. We can design from the perspective of a spatial network. So what we can do is, in this example, this was drawn manually, but we have a tool where we can generate a spatial network automatically. So we can generate a network, we can analyze that network before it's been built. We can check that it integrates with the surrounding parts of the city. We know that the levels of connectivity will affect where there are more people and where there are less people. That means we can start to make decisions about how wide streets should be, how to accommodate different scales and modes of movement. We can start to look at where certain land uses are better located than others, where density is better located. So what you end up with is places where the uses that need to be close to people, the shops, the cafes, those sorts of things, are on the better connected spaces. And the spaces which benefit from being further away from people, or that can survive anywhere, some of the residential places and the lower density places, those are on the streets which are more quiet. So we can start to, very early on, make sure that we're putting in place a spatial network that works with the way that people understand and use the city, and that creates the conditions that we've seen in cities around the world. So I'll just skip on from this so it doesn't play again. Now, the last bit I was going to talk through was an example of a project to show how we've used this. And this is actually something which is quite a few years old now, but this was looking at some unplanned settlements. They were classified as slums according to the UN definitions, and they had a whole range of different characteristics in them. Some of them had been built by the people that lived there now. Some of them were old bits of city that had become run down, and as the city they were part of had grown, the original people that built the houses and lived there had moved away, and the city had become run down and become worse and worse condition. There was a whole range of different conditions across all of them, but there was across the city 60 different areas, and all of them fulfilled the UN's criteria for being a slum. Now, the question there was that within that city, there were 60 different areas. There was too many to try to improve all at the same time. And so what we had to do was work out a way that you could objectively and quantitatively compare all of the different areas themselves, all of these different unplanned settlements. And not only that you could approach it objectively, but you could You could work across different scales. So you could explain what was happening in a particular area, as well as what was happening across the whole city. So we made spatial network models of the whole city. You can start to see on here, the red lines are showing you the streets which are important across the whole city. We can run the same type of analysis at a different scale. And what you can do is see the streets which are important locally. Now, this particular analysis picks out perfectly all of the unplanned settlements in this part of the city. And this is not the purpose of what we're talking about now, but this analysis was really interesting to explain some of the socioeconomic conditions and this process of decline that the unplanned settlements had been through. But we have a street network analysis, and we can use that to basically understand where are the more important places. We could also combine that with other data sets. We had data on building condition, the number of services and utilities they had access to, and we had data on public realm quality. We had that on a plot by plot level, and we had that across 50 of the 60 areas. What we could then start to do was for every different area, start to compare them, and we could start to categorize them. So we could look across the whole city and we could come up with a strategy to say, look, there's limited resource to be able to improve these areas. We want to do something that has the maximum benefit for people. There are limits to what can be done because you haven't got endless funding. And so we needed a way to be able to prioritize areas and to be able to specify particular interventions. So we could use this we've colored these. So the ones which are red have been grouped into a certain category. The ones which are orange all share similar characteristics across particular areas. What we could use that for as well was not just to prioritize what do you improve and how do you improve it, but to be really clear on the actions that you need to take for each one. So this group of settlements at the bottom, you can see that all of these cells are black because there's no data. So one of the key actions for these areas is the first thing that you need to do is collect data. What you could do for these settlements was a different type of intervention. Because you've got all of the data, you can start to understand what the problem is, and you can start to prepare. We were looking at a set of urban design projects to improve them. So we could group these, we could take the city, take all the 60 areas, sort them into categories, and then we could start to be really clear and really precise about what kind of interventions you need to make to each group. What we could then do was, again, use the same data, zoom in on an area, and we could start to then shape particular local design interventions. So what we're looking at here is the overlap between the spaces which are important to the wider city, but important locally. And the idea was that if we know that these relationships are consistent, the better connected spaces have more people passing through them. If you're going to try and improve one area and you've got limited funding to do that, you should improve the area that most people will benefit from and that most people will be exposed to. And so the idea was that you could identify a network of streets that were more important, that more people would benefit from. You could combine that with other data. So you could look at the quality of buildings. You can look at the public realm quality, if there's paving, if the roads are there, if it has streetlights, and you can look at utilities. And on the basis of that, you can develop a set of minimal interventions that are effectively trying to bring them the most benefit possible to the local area. And so these were some of the projects that came out of it. It was about very local scale public realm improvements that were tailored to a particular area, but also fitted into this wider strategy of how to improve places across a whole city. So that's the point where I'm going to finish. I think I've probably just gone over a couple of minutes, but hopefully that has talked a little bit about how to position data, this idea of what happens, where it happens, and when it happens, versus why it happens. Explained some of the way that we can start to analyze the built environment, and then talked about how using that understanding of the built environment and the way that certain spaces are used more than others, you can then start to target a set of interventions to improve certain places ahead of others. So thank you very much for listening. At that point, I'm going to stop sharing and I will hand back.
Дякую вам, Ed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Parham. That was a brilliant lecture. It was very interesting. And I think that it is time that we should start with the questions, continue with the questions. So we have quite a lot of questions whether to Adam, whether you can see also, you can have satellite images of weapon supplies, but I guess this is not the topic of our today's discussion. So presently, we have a question concerning I'm reading. Just a sec. I'm trying to get the meaning of this question. So Alexander Husiev is asking, could you elaborate a bit on which framework do you use to identify a building use type? As you mentioned, in particular, working specifically with aerial photos, and I think this is a question to Mr. Kňaze. So, how can you discuss this? Yeah, this question. You have the floor.
Yes, so we are using AI models as we are using to identify the building themselves. We are using them to then classify the buildings, classify the use, get some characteristics about them. I think what you are pointing to, though, is that we can't really be 100% certain with these kinds of assessments, and you are absolutely right. Like just from looking at the building from above, from aerial picture, for example, it's just impossible to say what's happening inside for certain. But the goal here is to identify outliers. So basically, we are focusing. So when we are talking about industrial buildings versus homes, for example, you can tell by the structure of the building, by the way it looks, by the surrounding area. There are indicators that the model can pick up, and that you can train the model to identify to basically tell you, okay, this is a high probability of a industrial building, for example. And then what you do with the data is you're not really focusing in these use cases on those sort of, let's say unclear cases, like when you are not sure. It's not about identifying that, oh, someone has 5 meters square more of some area that they are not paying tax for. It's about identifying the big cases, identifying large, let's say, buildings, industrial buildings that are clearly industrial, yet they are marked as homes, for example, or they are misclassified somehow. Or we are talking about buildings that reported, I don't know, 150 meters square. In reality, it's 400 meters. Or, I don't know, it doesn't have to be this huge of a difference, but basically, first of all, we are focusing on those clear cases, because even if we manage to solve those, which is typically majority, even if we manage to solve those, it's a huge benefit already. And so we don't really have to deal with every single, let's say, unclear case there.
Thanks, clear. We have another one, and that is actually, I think it's a question to both of you. Maybe it was first to Adam, but I think it's interesting to have an answer from both of you, and it's about ethical considerations. So Parth Mehta is asking, what ethical considerations should guide the design and the dissemination of satellite imagery? I would like to expand it to not just satellite imagery, but to data in general, particularly regarding privacy, surveillance, and the potential of misuse. And I thought of that, Adam, also when you mentioned and said that you can't fake satellite imagery. And of course, I immediately had to think about America bombing, getting a reason to attack on Iraq, because they had the proof in the satellite imagery, which in the end turned out to be fake indeed. So how do you consider those kind of things, and how do you work with it in practice? And do you see the dangers, or do you see how to find solutions to get around it, or how do you work with those?
Yeah, I will focus on the satellite images and aerial data. I will leave the other kinds of data to add. So you are right. I would maybe edit my statement then. You cannot fake the data, but you can come to fake conclusions based on the data. That is not something we can do anything about, unfortunately. I would say the situation is a bit better nowadays, especially because there are multiple constellations. You have multiple different sources from public and private sector. So it's sort of more difficult to spin the data in the direction that's not realistic. Regarding the privacy and misuse, I would say, so real just sort of practical point of view here. For satellites, my understanding is generally it's considered that, oh, it's okay. And the reason for that is that with satellites, at least with the commercially available ones, the best resolution you can get is 30 centimeters. So 1 pixel of an image is 30 by 30 centimeters. You can see cars there quite clearly, but you cannot see individual people. Most of the time you can maybe tell that there is a crowd somewhere, but you cannot identify individual people. And so I would say sort of it's not written anywhere, but basically it was kind of understood that this kind of resolution is okay to use. Then if you have aerial and drone data, this is obviously much more intrusive. So typically in most countries, you have to have some sort of license to operate these, to collect these kinds of images. And there are typically rules about what can you collect, with what purposes you can collect it. Typically, if you are public sector, if you're a city, you can collect the data because you are making the rules. But for the private actors, it's a bit more restricted. Lastly, I would say it's about with these different data sources is about the risk of misuse. So the reason why the satellite data is not as restricted is because of the lower resolution. We basically typically it's harder to find these cases to misuse them. Though, to be honest, it is not completely free for all. So, for example, if you wanted to now buy pictures of Ukraine, satellite pictures of Ukraine, you cannot really do that for obvious reasons. So you would have to be very, very clearly and thoroughly vetted before any of these providers will sell you pictures of Ukraine, because it could be misused here. So yeah, this is current situation and point of view here.
So I think that the points that I would add would be that I think I mean, I think the really obvious clear risk of some of the work that you could do is that it becomes really easy to identify critical elements or things which could have the most disruption. I mean, I think there's probably a question in there, which is that when you're in a kind of a war situation, then probably there's already an understanding of what those elements are or what those systems are anyway. I think there's questions for me which are around not so much whether it's satellite data, but some of these questions around open data, open source tools, because in some ways we might be able to make a model of somewhere, but the data sets that we've made that from, they could be an open data set that anybody can use. They might be analyzed using open source tools that people can use as well. And so it's not impossible for other people to remake the same data sets. So I think there are some issues there about how data becomes open, what you're using it for, the tools that people are using, how you try to encourage people to use them in the right way or to use them for a positive purpose. I think there are a whole set of other ethical questions which are around when you start to link data sets from different domains, and when you might start to take data on the built environment, and where you can see that there are certain characteristics of combinations of different urban systems that make places easier to get to or more difficult to get to. And if you say combine that with socioeconomic data or data about demographic data about the characteristics of the people, in a really positive way, you can use that to make sure that where you have higher levels of inequality, that the places that have got the lowest income, the most deprived places, have got access to everything that they need. But obviously you can use that data in the exact opposite way. And I mean, it's slightly different condition that if you were really, if you're politically cynical, you could be making sure that, I don't know, people that weren't going to vote for you were not getting the services they need. So these are really difficult questions, and some of them are, maybe some of them are outside the hands of what a designer or a planner can do. But I think what you can do is make sure that you can use the data to understand how what you're doing will have a positive impact in the longer term. The risk of this next bit is that it might be a bit of a tangent, but I think some of the outcomes that I was talking about earlier were things around like health, and outcomes like health are really complex, and that's the things that affect that can be the characteristics that you inherit from your parents, the diet that you have, your income, but also where you live affects it as well, because that means that you can be active more easily or not. So if you're a designer or a planner, you can't ever guarantee that a certain outcome will happen, but all that you can do is make it possible that those things will happen. And I think that's the bit that's really important, is if you're a planner or a designer, you can use the data to understand how is what we're doing going to affect what is most likely to happen, and how can we then use that to improve somewhere sooner or make it possible for certain things to happen.
Yes, thanks.
Дуже дякуємо. У мене питання теж.
And I have a question. My personal question to Adam. Adam, can you please say, you have presented us with the combinations of data which you can get from satellites. Actually, the amount of data is unprecedentedly detailized. Do you already have any experience of collaboration which your company has with other companies in terms of providing such very detailed, extra detailed data, climate data, urban planning data, to create new neighborhoods? Because we understand that these kind of data you have presented will prompt a new level of planning efficiency, and in combination with sociological and demographic data, it could really provide great results.
Yeah, so to be completely honest, not really to that extent. You're talking specifically about combining different high precision data types, data sources. We haven't really done a lot of that so far. I believe there's still sort of a gap in capabilities and expectations. So you have you have people who are experts in urbanism, and oftentimes they don't necessarily know, they don't have the information about all kinds of data that are now available. And so then they cannot really make use of that. Whereas I'm on the technical side of things. I know what kind of data I can collect, what kind of data is available. I sometimes lack the understanding of what would be the use of it in urbanism. So there is this kind of disconnect that I mean, hopefully events like this could help bridge in the future. I believe this is changing now, but this is main blocker right now.
I think this, if I can feed into this as well, I think there's a really interesting, like you're just saying, Adam, this overlap between domain expertise and technical expertise, and crossing that gap is really important, I think. We have worked on a set of tools that are about generative master planning. So we can so from the models that we make, we can understand what are the characteristics of cities where certain positive outcomes happen. How do you make it walkable? How do you develop a street network? How does that work in different ways? And we have made a set of generative tools that can make a street network. We can make sure that it's walkable, that it's the right size, that it's intelligible. we can analyze it, and then we can apply, define parcels of land within it, allocate densities and uses and these sorts of things. It's not using satellite data, but there's a really interesting thing which I think we're very close to, which is to generate things in a way that is more consistent than people doing it individually, and learning from what happens in, it's really this idea of evidence-based design, to be able to understand where these outcomes happen, what do they share in common, and how can we then almost kind of reverse engineer from that to say, how do you design a street network that allows people to walk every day and to get to these things, and then where do you distribute the land use? So we've got something that we've used it on a couple of competitions, and it's done very well. But yeah, it's things are developing all the time really quickly, I think.
I'm looking at our...
Дуже вам вдячний за ваші відповіді.
Thank you very much for your answering.
Так, Левет, будь ласка.
New open question to Adam. Can you import your data into GIS systems, which is open source and accessible for everybody, like
Yes.
Syntax is doing?
Yes, and I would add, like, we are doing as well. Like, we are based on open source GIS stack as well. So QGIS is our main sort of weapon here. I mean, yeah, look, the data itself you can use anywhere, right? You can use QGIS, you can use ArcGIS. It's what you do with it. Usually we don't necessarily process the data in QGIS directly. We have our sort of Python modules and AI models that are processing the data, and then we work with the results in QGIS.
Yeah, that's, I mean, this relates to indeed creating data that can be used by multiple disciplines and by multiple expertise. And if we get as far as the data being collected as open source as possible, but also being distributed as open source as possible, you come to a huge amount of possibilities. And I think then also get to this point that the earlier question of the misuse of it immediately counters, like yeah, if you really have like the wisdom of the crowd, being able to immediately counter things, and that's what you also said, Adam, at one point. There are multiple others immediately there to look at it and to come with an alternative vision on it. So I think that
100% agree.
There was a few years ago, there was this interesting conversation that was more within the data science community, which was about this question of misuse of data, or not misuse. It was about the, I guess, malevolent use of data. And one of the ideas that people were talking about was the idea of the equivalent of a Hippocratic oath. So the same oath that doctors take to say that they will try to help people all the time. There was this idea that people working in data science should be doing the same thing, because it can be misused by lots of people. So there's probably a whole series of things that have to happen across systems, and some of it is at individual level. How do you encourage people to follow a certain code of conduct? There are lots and lots of benefits to making things open, but there is obviously risk that comes with that as well, and it's working with those two things against each other.
yes, we have been working a lot on that kind of oath for architects, as a matter of fact, because that could be just as valuable to create that. I'm looking at two things, the Q&A, but at the same time at the time. So we are about to closing this discussion, and I think we might have time for one more poignant question from the audience, but if it's not there, maybe Ken, do you have something urgent to bring up, or you to each other? And if not, then let's call it an evening and get everybody to their evening and they're eating and their dishes in depending on the time zones that you're in. I thought it's extremely interesting what you were explaining to us, and I hope to we in Roskvit stay in contact with both of you. We've put some website information in the chat so people can also have a look and maybe can in contact with you. Further, this lecture is recorded and it will be on our YouTube channel. So some people asked about recording and it will be there. So follow Roskvit, look at YouTube, and there you will find all the previous lectures as well and the lectures coming up. So yeah, thank you so much for being here, and of course most thanks go to Ed and Adam for giving their insights. Thank you a lot, and of course Olena for doing this excellent translation again and again for us. So maybe you can use some very last words.
Так, було надзвичайно цікаво.
Right, it was really very interesting. These 90 minutes really were spent very quickly. We are so grateful for your time, for your contribution to the development of Ukraine, and for your participation. We hope to see you again. And dear audience, you are invited to all our further events. Thank you very much for finding time for us today.
Thank you very much.